Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this online event. My name is Jasmine. Many of you will know me from Carcanet Press events online already. I'm just going to run over the schedule quickly and let you know some technical bits of the Zoom room before we get going properly. So thank you very, very much for joining us to launch this new book, which is coming out in Carcanet's Lives and Letters imprint. Alexander Goehr, Composing a Life, Teachers, Mentors and Models, which is written by Alexander Goehr and co-written by Jack Van Zandt, sorry. Both of whom we have here, which is very exciting. They're going to come on screen shortly after my introduction now. The book also includes an introduction by Sally Groves. But before we get to the content of the book and the launch itself properly, I'm just going to do a bit of housekeeping as usual. So tonight we'll be together for about an hour. Please do find the chat box, say hello to us in the chat, let us know where you're watching from and what you think of the reading and the event. We'd love to hear from you as we go through this evening together. Please do make sure you change the settings so that it's landed on everyone so that we can see each other's messages, otherwise they get lost. Now, the music that you could hear just when you were logging in then was an aria from Alexander Goehr's opera Behold the Sun. So I'm also going to put that little link in the chat for you there so you can go and find that later if you want to have a listen on your own. So what's going to happen tonight? I have a video that I'm going to stream for you, and after that Jack is here and he's going to read an excerpt live from the book for you. Now while Jack's reading, I'm going to have some text up on screen as a bit of a visual guide for you to follow along with while he's reading, so just be aware that you're in control of your own screen at that point. If you need Jack's face to be bigger and the text to be smaller, you can do that. You should be able to have a play around and reconfigure it to suit your needs. But if you have any technical problems, as ever, pop them in the chat while we're here and I'll do my best to help you as we go through this evening's event. Later on, Alexander and Jack will be on screen together. They will have a bit of conversation and there will also be time for your own questions. So as well as finding the chat and saying hello to us in there, please find another button. It says Q&A on it. And if you have any questions for Sandy or for Jack, you can get them lined up in there and we'll be able to get to them later on in the event. So finally, thank you for paying your £2 to be here. That's great. We really appreciate it. I've put the link to buy the book in the chat for you. So all of that info is waiting for you there for later on. So it's my pleasure to introduce our guests this evening. We are joined by Alexander Sandy Goehr, who is a British composer and emeritus professor of music at Cambridge University. Sandy moved to England in 1933 and at the Royal College of Music in Manchester formed the Manchester School, a group of young composers and musicians, including Peter Maxwell Davies, Harrison Birtwistle and John Ogden. He came to prominence in England in the late 1950s and early 1960s as a radical exponent of serial music. Since then, he's composed more than 100 major works, including operas, orchestral and chamber pieces, and music for film, television, dance and theatre. Sandy is one of Europe's most important music educators. He was a lecturer at Southampton University, professor of music at Leeds University, and finally the professor of music at Cambridge University for more than 25 years. He has taught many successful composers, theorists, and musicologists. Over the course of his life, he has written and lectured extensively, and his works are performed all over the world, including last week. We were very pleased to host a world premiere of a new string quartet by Sandy here at the RNCM in Manchester, and we'll have a recording of that up on our YouTube soon, I hope. So that event also included a world premiere of a piece by Sandy's co-writer on this project, Jack Van Zandt. Jack is an award-winning composer of music for concerts, film and TV, and is a music educator based in Los Angeles and Ireland. He is a former pupil of, as well as musical and teaching assistant to Sandy Goehr, having studied and worked with him in Cambridge between 1976 and 1985. Jack was recently a music faculty member at the University of Colorado and at CalArts in California. In Los Angeles, he is a new music concert producer and a founder and co-director of the Beyond Opera Collective. Jack has also worked, interestingly, as a US and Irish trade book publisher in the 1990s, and has published much of his own music and arts journalism over the years. So to start, we're going to see a video that Jack and Sandy have prepared. They're going to be in conversation to introduce the project and introduce the book to you. And then after that, they will be on screen and you'll see Jack reading from the box. So without further ado, I'm going to share the video with you. Okay.
I'm Jack Van Zandt, and I'm here with Alexander Sandy Goehr, the composer and emeritus professor of music at Cambridge University. And we're the co-authors of a book titled Composing a Life, Teachers, Mentors, and Models. And as by way of introducing our book to you, our audience, I thought we would just discuss exactly what we mean by this title and what our readers can expect to find in this book. Like I said, we call it Composing a Life, and in many ways this book is an autobiographical book where Sandy talks about how he learned to be a composer from his various teachers and mentors, and how he put those lessons to work in his own music throughout his lifetime.
From a relatively early age, I come from a musical family, and I wasn't good enough to be a performer. I played various instruments, but not very well. And composition seemed to be the thing that attracted me. And so I decided to do that. Not entirely, as readers to the book will find out, with the approval of my parents particularly. But I don't want this book. When you first proposed to me that we attempt to do this, I was rather against it, and it was really the success of the Skype that somehow led on, in which I explained why I'm not someone who wishes to have any biography, or for that matter, autobiography written about me. I don't want to, I'm sure there's a connection between life and art, but I don't wish to stress it, and I don't know what it is. Not clear to me. And therefore, I wanted, when we set out to do this, I really set out to record my memories of my teachers, and that figures in the book. And I also wished to include not my teachers, but my mentors, which were people of varying types who had a strong influence and who possibly added something or subtracted something from what I was doing or what I thought. And you'll find those in the book. And I should say one thing, it's necessarily that one's memory, especially if one's over 90, which I regret that I am, that one's memory plays false, and none of this is necessarily true. It's just what I remember of the impression. And these were strong impressions, and they were almost all immediate impressions. I tend to be someone who forms a view of somebody else, or a teacher or a mentor, straight away. Other people surely are different. And those people who I instantly related to, or who influenced me, remain with me, along with a lot of other people who remain with me, but they're not mentioned. And it was you, really, who decided the form of the book, because originally I was only thinking about the teachers and mentors, but you added a number of, or persuaded me with your very good questions and generally authority over me. You persuaded me to go into the business of models, which is something which is close to my way of thinking. And also various other things. I mean, Schoenberg was neither my teacher nor my mentor, but there is, in fact, a section on Schoenberg, because in our family, he was a very strong influence. My father was a pupil of his, and he was always a shadow, although I've gone a long way away from it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important part of the book. Is, I mean, one of the reasons we made your father, your memories of your father in terms of, you know, being a musician and being around him and learning from him, actually became the coda, or the final word in our book, because I think it kind of helps frame your entire experience as a student of music in your life. One thing I was going to ask you maybe to just elaborate on is the difference between teachers and mentors, the kind of like formality and informality aspect of this, because I know in our relationship, I've had both of those with you. And you discussed that in the book. Could you just like maybe address that a little bit, say about the difference between teachers and mentors?
I'd like to say something about that. Thank you for asking. Teaching, I was lucky with my teachers. I can think of people who I might have studied with who wouldn't have been a positive influence on me. But I was very lucky in all of them. And as I said before, the impression was almost instant. And I do believe that the relationship between a composer and a pupil and his teacher doesn't last very long, because the pupil, a composition student, must be a personality in themselves. They must have views. They must have preferences or dislikes or prejudices, come to that. And they are either respected or not respected by the teacher. And you have to some extent, surrender to a teacher. But once maybe in my case, the short period of direct teaching veers off into a more general relationship, then it becomes that of a mentor. But then, of course, you can have also a mentor who is not a teacher.
Yes.
All the mentors I mentioned were not people who I claimed to have been a pupil of. And in fact, Olivier Messiaen once said to his class, which was called Philosophie de Musique in Paris, a pretentious title, but it didn't mean much. And he said, anyone who says they were a pupil of mine is a liar, because I've never taught composition. I think later on, one or two people were pupils, and he did teach them. But he somehow, he was a teacher because we sat in a class round a table, and we sat there for 12 hours a week, which is extraordinary when you think about it, how one group of people for 12 hours a week.
Yeah.
And the figure of Gounod, as it grew dark, appearing through the lighted window in reflection at the Conservatoire. But the mentor thing was also in it, and that's what remains.
Yeah, and I think, you know, part of my part of this book was to describe, from my point of view, how it worked when I was both your pupil and your mentee, I guess you would call it. I think the lines are a little bit blurred with us because I was there with you as your assistant and so forth for a TA for a long time. And I think whereas I think when I first began with you, you were very much a teacher. It was a little bit more formal, and you were like looking at pieces and saying I should think about this or think about that. But really, pretty soon after that, it became more of a guidance than anything. You would guide me to different places to look at this or read this book, or oh, you're interested in that. Well, you should look at this philosopher or this painter or whatever. And I think that's the more informal aspect of it. It was more social, like around the dinner table kind of chat. And I think that's pretty much was my experience, and I think the part of this book that I think is really important is like that we show the way that you became a composer. Most of the book is about that and how you put those lessons to your life as a composer, but also about how you pass that tradition on to me, to the next generation, and how I have done that to the generation following mine. And I think we're trying to make a point about how musical DNA kind of operates through this kind of system, like this stream of the tradition, which I think is important. And that's why I think this book is important because we're using your life as an example of how one does become a composer and operates as a composer through a lifetime. Now, I just want to, our time is limited, but I wanted to ask you one more question, and maybe for our readers, is what do you hope our readers will take away from this book?
Heaven knows whether they'll take anything away. I think they should take away that a composer feels on the one hand, that he or she, have failed, and on the other hand, is trying to make a living, like being a composer
Yeah.
in sort of public way. And there is a sort of, if you like, a contradiction, and at the same time, a complementary aspect to this. I mean, I feel, especially at my advanced age, I'm aware of the limitations of what I have done. If I was already a fully fledged academic, before I remembered that, or found out that you had to breathe while composing, and that when one does complicated things like 12-tone Babbitt type things, one doesn't breathe, and you have to breathe in order to create musical phrases, because otherwise it doesn't speak to anybody. And so I should say, although I'm on a Skype, that I have to breathe now in order to communicate something to this, answering your question, to the potential hopeful reader of this compendium which you've put together.
Well, thank you for that. So, well, thank you very much to our audience, our Carcanet audience on this YouTube channel. I'd just like to say I'm Jack Van Zandt, and I'm a composer, and I'm here with my co-author and longtime teacher, mentor, and friend, Sandy Goehr, and our book is called Composing a Life, Teachers, Mentors, and Models. And we thank you for your attention.
So thank you to Jack and Sandy for providing that video for us. Next, Jack is going to join us on screen, and we're going to have a reading from the book. There we go.
Hello. So I'm here with Sandy Goehr in his home near Cambridge, and we've chosen a passage to read from the first chapter in the book about Sandy's childhood. And I'll just set it up before I start reading it from some of my introductory material, where I say, born in 1932 in Berlin, Sandy has no memory of the city as his parents left Germany and brought him to England when he was an infant. His father, Walter Goehr, a native Berliner and pupil of Schoenberg's in the 1920s, was a well-known conductor and composer who worked for the BBC before and during the Second World War and through the 1950s. His photographer mother, Lelia, née Rivlin, had studied piano in her native Kiev, which was then in Russia. After the Russian Revolution, she moved to Berlin, where she later worked as a professional musician and met Walter. So music was in Goehr's blood and in his life from the very beginning. He attended preparatory school in Amersham. At the age of 10, he was sent as a boarder to a public school, King Edward VI School in Berkhamsted, largely because his father was doing his BBC work in London and his mother was busy doing her war work, which was photography. So he begins this story of being in Berkhamsted this way. I wasn't the best and I wasn't the worst student in my class at Berkhamsted. I was given a relatively good education, one that stayed with me for life and helped form whatever I am to this day. The first two important influences of my life, leaving aside my father, were the composer Michael Tippett, who was in our house a great deal in Amersham, and my Greek and Latin teacher in Berkhamsted, Mr. Hill, an older man who had come back from retirement as the younger teachers were all away in the military doing war work. At the time, a student was required to specialize in a subject. I had no scientific interest in, but I liked mathematics. However, I opted for Greek, Latin, and ancient history. By the age of 17, I had reached a reasonably high standard in both classical languages. We learned to translate them into English and to translate English into Greek or Latin, which is more difficult. The texts we translated were usually short passages of classical prose. I have a memory of one important lesson I had received from Mr. Hill. In my translations, my teacher made me realize that even though they weren't bad, they were somewhat superficial. I was imitating the external style, but not getting at the real meaning of the passages I was working on. That memory has stayed with me all my life. I always consider that what I do is slightly superficial at first, and that I have to work hard to get at the real meaning of something. I was affected the same way later when I learned counterpoint from Yvon Loriot in Paris, and it still is the case with me today in that I think the first sketches of what I compose tend to be a bit superficial, and they need to be worked on to get at what is implicit in the notes. So Mr. Hill was very important for giving me that lesson, and also for helping me develop a love of classical literature that has stayed with me ever since. There are important moments in school when you find out, whether from a teacher or another student who is doing it better, that you are failing at something or aren't doing it as well as you could, and you suddenly become aware of something that helps you improve. That is when you really learn a lesson that lasts. When I talk about my teachers or someone who has influenced me, I am talking about a very short period of time. In fact, what I got from my teachers might have taken only 5 minutes. And certainly the period of time when a student and teacher connect is very brief, something like 2 or 3 months. I think one of the faults of modern education is that it goes on far too long. The years-long study for PhDs in composition is an embarrassment of sorts. What I learned from my teachers in music took about 3 months. After that, it was a situation of having a friendly coffee or drink with them and being encouraged, but it wasn't the same as those initial short periods. It takes only a split second to really get something. Then you just need to go off and do it. In our home, there was a lot of music, of course, and my mother and father both being musicians. My first musical memories are of trying to compose something at about age 6 with a few notes on paper, but it didn't make any sense. My mother kept some of my earliest composing efforts consisting of a few minims, some of them on the 5 lines and some of them not. The first piece I remember trying to play was Stravinsky's The Five Fingers, which is a set of children's pieces. I had piano, violin, and clarinet lessons as a young boy at home, and sadly I was not very good at any of them. More than learning to play an instrument, I was secretly interested in composition. Because Michael Tippett worked with my father, he came to our house in Amersham a lot, as my father was helping with the orchestration of his opera A Midsummer Marriage and other things. Tippett was the first person to encourage me, which my father didn't do. I had kept my composing secret until about the age of 16 or 17 and didn't talk about it. I was trying to set poems in Greek and Latin by Horace and Catullus, and also preludes by T.S. Eliot, who was a close friend of Tippett's. Tippett's music of the time was my first experience of modern music, and I have had a great love and enthusiasm for his work to this day. When I finally did tell my father that I was interested in composition, he thought it was ridiculous because I was reasonably good at whatever else I did, but I was not particularly good at that. He was rather hostile to my musical interest, but Tippett spoke up for me and said that I should do whatever I wanted to do and felt deeply about, and whether I was good at it or bad at it was of quite secondary importance. When I finally did take it up, both my father and Tippett, and later my teacher at Manchester, Richard Hall, said, "You take it up for its own sake because you'll never make a penny from it." My father liked to say that Schoenberg didn't make any money from the great pieces he wrote. Later on in my life, I did much better than I would have thought then, but I was prepared in my late teens and early 20s to do it for its own sake, and 70 years later, I still am. Sometimes they pay me, and sometimes they don't. So that was a portion of the first chapter of our book, where Sandy describes his childhood and goes on. One of the interesting things that happens in this chapter that I was going to ask him to maybe tell you about is once he finished his schooling at age 18, of course, in 1950, like all men at the time, he was required to do national service. And he has an interesting story about how he fulfilled that and what happened to him during that time. So, Sandy, maybe you could tell him a little bit about that.
I was, to put it briefly, a conscientious objector, very much under the influence of Michael Tippett and one of the masters at Berkhamsted. And I was taken to the Peace Pledge Union by Michael Tippett. And I think Vera Brittain, who ran it, actually looked after me and put me through the tribunal. I then found myself in the slightly contradictory position of becoming a mass murderer because I had to do farm work, and later on I worked in a hospital, and I had to slaughter chickens in large numbers, which didn't fit easily with my conscientious objection, and taught me an important lesson, I think. Later on, because I was in the socialist Zionist movement, having emigrated there from a more Stalinist position, which I didn't approve of, I became a hospital worker, working as a ward orderly, and I learned this was a kind of second education. I was privileged to be educated at a very good public school and doing classics. And then I was a farm worker and a hospital orderly, and that was my second education.
Yeah.
And through my father, I found my way to Richard Hall, and he was a former priest and an organist, and he became my teacher, and he taught me a lot. And it was an example of my first example. I was full of opinions on various subjects, things I did and didn't know about, really. And he disabused me of a great deal of nonsense that I was thinking and talking. And I learned a great deal from him. Is that all?
Yeah. So I'm wondering if anybody out there has a question that, or if not, let's see, what do we got? Let me just see if I can see this. There it is.
Here we do have one question that's in the chat box.
Can you read it out, because it's hard for me to see?
Yeah, I will. Yeah, I just saw it come in. So thanks, Kirsty, for your question. So she asks, in a teacher and pupil or mentor and mentee relationship, even the most creative, can it be possible ever really for there to be an inversion of the senior and junior figure? Does the teacher not always remain a teacher? Or if not the case, how might such an inversion have presented in your own musical education? And she's asking that to the both of you.
I'm sure if I think of my teachers particularly, that the respect I had for them remains to this day. Richard Hall and Olivier Messiaen um, who were my principal teachers, I think I'm always junior to them. And the mentors is a slightly different thing, because with a mentor, you don't necessarily have to agree with what the mentor says. I mean, the mentors mentioned in the book, Pierre Boulez, Ulrich Siegele, Alan Hacker, were all people who added something, but it wasn't the same as being a pupil.
I would say, like, from my point of view with Sandy, is when we had a more, at the very beginning, when we had a more formal teacher pupil relationship, it was, I wouldn't have tried to influence him at all by any means. I was trying to be influenced by him. And he would ask me questions about, oh, what music are you interested in, or what are you trying to do? I was trying to do this or that, and he would say, okay, well, if you want to know how to do that, he would tell me, you have to do it a certain way, and you've got to do 12 of those by next week or something. You know, it was like a real a real teaching pupil experience. But later on, and it didn't take long. I mean, after just a few months, it was more informal. Then he would ask me about things, or I would come in and I would tell him, I would tell him something that I was interested in, or a book that I would bring a book to him. I remember bringing Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, Bach to you, and I was trying to figure out what it was all about, and we were trying, and it was more of a two-way street, and he would be interested in these ideas. Not that he would take them up or do anything about them in his music or anything, but in terms of, like, he would take them on and help me figure out a way to use these influences myself. And that's kind of an inversion in a way, because it was more like coming from my direction than from his direction telling me what I should do. So it does happen for sure. Yeah.
I think I can add something I have thought before, that the relationship between a composition teacher and his composition pupil is like someone throwing a ball in the air and someone else either catching it or not catching it.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. I hope that answers your question anyway. Do you have another one?
We don't currently have any more audience questions, so I'm going to leave it open to you, Jack, to pose something to Sandy.
Okay, well, let's talk about, I thought that one of the things that interested me about that passage that we read is, like, it really, how the lesson that he learned from Mr. Hill impacted his life carrying forward. But your first real music education came from Richard Hall which is now called the Royal Northern College of Music, where we were last week when we launched this book.
Yes, it was up the road. It was the Royal Manchester College way.
And what there's an interest. I think I'm very interested in. So when you first started with Richard Hall, he had some interesting ideas which you took and elaborated on and became part of your everyday usage as a composer later on, isn't it?
Yes, right? You're referring to pentatonicism. He believed that basically I, perhaps others do, couldn't manipulate harmony in an effective way. And so he gave one a pentatonic scale, 5 notes, and the thing about a pentatonic scale is the harmony that's derived from it um, by alternate notes or something like that, always produce agreeable harmony. There's not great dissonance involved. And I wrote these little studies in pentatonic, and then I added the other 5 notes. If you look at a piano, 5 notes are white and 5 notes are black. 7 notes are white, in fact. And if you add the 2 together, you get 2 pentatonic scales. And I first of all used them in alternation, and then I tried to combine them. And this, in fact, led me rather quickly to a version of a 12-tone technique, of the Schoenbergian technique, which I adopted really because tonal music I seemed to produce rather miserable results, and pentatonicism, I felt with 10 notes that I was achieving a little more. It was a little better than the so-called tonal pieces. And so it was a method which he had evolved. I think he was during the Great Depression in the 30s, he had worked in the pipe movement, which is the predecessor of recorders, and he had composed for pipes, and he taught unemployed workers because there was a general strike on, and it was a Great Depression. And that's how he formed this idea.
Yeah, and I think the important thing about that story to me is it was something that happened rather quickly in a lesson, with your teacher, and it didn't take very long, like you said before. Something could happen very quickly.
Well, he thought that the early examples of my prowess were bloody awful, and he then I had to work a bit to sort of try and improve.
Yeah, but the fact is, I mean, that idea had such a resonance throughout, really, even till today.
It did,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
And that's very much to the point of what you were making earlier.
I think that's the point, that one picks up various things from various people, teachers, mentors, and you choose, or you don't choose. Perhaps it's chance. I strongly believe in the role of chance in all this. It was chance that drove me on, not intention, and so it remained until chance stopped. In old age, don't do any more. But on the other hand, the Mr. Hill's example, which I ought to talk a little more about superficiality, one tends to regard the word superficial as pejorative, and yet when it comes to composing, it's not a pejorative, neither for a composer, nor for a writer, nor for the painter. It's an arbitrary beginning, just as there will finally have to be an arbitrary end. And the arbitrary beginning is bound to be, well, meaningless in its way, and yet it contains a seed which leads you on. And I think the nature of superficial, immediate, imitative, because after all, most young composers and not so young composers actually function by imitating others. You imitate something you've heard. Someone says, is it Beckett? I don't know. Someone says, you start with many people and gradually many people disappear and you're left on your own. And many people is superficiality, and on your own is where you have to be in order to try and improve. And you have to learn to improve. And that's what composition teaching is, that you should help people to find ways of improving what they do, because no one is born a genius, or at least some people are, but I wasn't.
I think you have another question there, Jasmine, do you?
We certainly do have another question. This is from Andrew Logan, who says you are both very individual composers with your own styles, but are your own styles influenced in any way by each other's styles, both teacher to pupil and vice versa?
Well, I'm going to let you answer that one first.
Well, I don't know. I can't answer that question because style is not something that concerns me much. I'm as a composer, I suppose I'm less interested in the final result than in the process of doing it. That's probably why I was given teaching jobs, because the process of composition, whether it's very ancient Bach, Sweelinck, Handel, or very recent Boulez, Ligeti, others, they have their limitations and they have their advantages, and I'm interested in how it's done rather than in the results. I'm not a great listener to music. I'm more interested in the procedures.
Yeah, and I think from my point of view, everything he said there is basically the way I pretty much feel about it too. I mean, I think he passed that on to me. Now I know our music doesn't sound alike, but it doesn't sound all that different either. I noticed the other night, it's funny, I mean, we've known each other for almost 50 years. And the other night in Manchester was the very first time I think we had pieces in the same concert. And the one thing I noticed, like, I wasn't happy about having to follow one of his pieces, but one of the things I noticed about it is they did have a kind of they were very sympathetic to one another in a way that
Well,
they sound, and
glad to hear it.
and they weren't so different in a way. And I think, I mean, not only was I a student of Sandy's, but I came to him because I had heard his music and I was interested in his music. And so that had as much an influence on me to begin with as he did as a teacher and a person. And I tried early on doing making pieces in a similar way that he was just describing, with 12 tone by using a 12-tone rose in that very way. And I found I understood his music more. It didn't really it wasn't my music in a way. It was, but you know what I mean. It was more, I could understand his attraction to it because it was a very interesting way of the process, like he says. It was an interesting way of creating music. And I think for me, I'm all about the process to begin with. I love the process of it. But I'm always trying to find a process that works, that makes a piece that somebody would want to listen to. Maybe it's not just pure process, but definitely I'm on that team, the process team. Yeah.
So maybe just as we come towards the end of the hour that we have together, and we're talking about processes, I wonder what was the process like of doing this project together, and what did you learn about each other maybe that you didn't know before, and how did it compare to the compositional process in music?
Well, my initial experience of this book was the idea that I should not write such a book or contribute to such a book. I had no idea. The only thing after an initial Skype between Cambridge or Swaffham Prior and Los Angeles was that the session in which I told Jack that I didn't think it was a good idea turned out rather well, and this led on. This led on to the formulation of the idea, and again, it was a chance because it was not in my mind to do any such thing. I'm rather shy about contributing things like this. But, you know, in the end, Jack persuaded and did a remarkable job because it's really his book, not mine. I figure in it, obviously, but he made it, and he included everything that is included in it. And there you are, and thank you, Jack.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I'd say from my point of view, first of all, you saw a little bit of what it was like for us to make this book at the very beginning with the video. I was in my studio in Los Angeles, and Sandy was sitting over there in the corner, and we would meet. We did it for once a week, and we would choose a subject or a teacher or mentor that we would talk about. And every week we would meet at the time we agreed to. It was usually night here and early afternoon in Los Angeles, and we would just discuss as he had some prepared thoughts, but basically we would just discuss whatever the subject was that week, and we did that for. It took us. It's 7 years ago now that we started this.
And then I'm not always discreet in what I say. So Jack then sent me transcripts, and I sort of cut out the things that I hadn't wanted to be perpetuated in a book, and sort of rewrote bits.
Well, we both said things we took out, so I mean it's fine. But it was just such an incredibly interesting experience. Now, look, we've known each other a long time, and we've had these discussions before. That's what gave me the idea to begin with to do this, because we would have these usually sometimes I'd visit and we'd sit here by this fireplace in this room with a good bottle of Irish whiskey, and we'd go half the night talking about these subjects. And so I really wanted to put his thoughts down, but also on the other side, he touched on something there. Part of the reason I wanted to do this was to understand get a better understanding of me, not only as a composer, but as a person, because he's been such an important person in my life, and the lessons I've learned from him really made it possible for me to be a composer. And now that
Thank you.
now that I'm, you know, I'm pushing 70 and I actually make my living as a composer, I have him to thank for it, because I don't think I could have gotten here without him. And he's been,
I'm sure you could.
well, but you have been very supportive of me my whole life, and I appreciate that. But anyway, so the book was that part too. Me trying to understand what it was that you know I was doing in our relationship. So, you know, I think from that point of view, maybe we did okay at it. But anyway, is that what you wanted to hear from us? Jasmine?
Anyway, before we close, I want to thank Carcanet, who are a poetry publisher, whom I have several books published by them on the shelf up there, and Michael Schmidt, who was a visitor in this house many times, and I think they've done a great job.
Yes,
haven't
and
they?
well, this
Mm.
person right here, Jasmine, you know, she's the person that's really been in charge of
Well,
us this
thank
whole
you, Jasmine.
through this whole period. And also, I just want to mention our fabulous editor from Carcanet, Maren Meinhardt, who really we worked great together, and I just love
Anyway,
her.
it's a great privilege to have a book published by Carcanet, who've published so many books of poetry.
Yeah.
All of them tend to be distinguished and nothing stupid.
Yeah, we're very happy to be with Carcanet. We both are. So
And we are very, very happy to have you. So yeah, thank you both so much for your work on this, and congratulations on the publication. Thank you for your time this evening too. It's been really, really nice to see you together in the same room. That's been really sweet. Thank you guys for being here, and for your questions in the chat. That's been really, really good to see. I've put the link for you in the chat again. You do have a discount code to get a discounted copy of the book from our website. But as usual, if you have any problems getting hold of that, just send me an email and I'll do my best to help you. So that's everything from us. I think this may well have been our last Zoom event of the year. So thank you for being here. And congratulations again to you guys, Sandy and Jack. I hope you can go and raise a glass around that fire.
We're going to do that right now.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jasmine.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.